I remember when George Floyd was murdered, so many people that I work with in my then organization here in London were affected deeper than others because, of course, they could relate to that much more. So how do we provide spaces to those people? I've found a way to navigate that space between these groups, hopefully without alienating any of them. And I'm planning to continue, be it through data, through accountability to affected communities, humanitarian quality, or anything like that. Because the moment we start perceiving the entire countries and communities as the other, very different from us, I think this is where our humanitarian intentions and values fail.
I'm your host, Soraya Sinozie, and this is Diaspora and Development, where we give voice to people of the diaspora working in international development. Today's guest is Marina Kobveza, a humanitarian leader with nearly 2 decades of experience in disaster response, accountability, and data-driven aid. From her childhood encounter with humanitarian aid to her leadership roles with organizations like MapAction, Christian Aid, and the UN, Marina has been a relentless advocate for ethical and effective aid. In this episode, she shares powerful insights on decolonizing humanitarian efforts, shifting resources to local responders, and the moral dilemmas facing the sector today. Join us for a thought-provoking conversation on the future of aid, the resilience of local communities, and why true humanitarianism starts with listening. Let's dive in. Thank you for joining us today, Marina. You have worked for many years in the humanitarian field. Can you tell us what you're doing today?
Thank you for having me. I'm currently the Program and Partnerships Director with MapAction. MapAction is a small humanitarian organization that works on ensuring that the decisions of bigger humanitarian actors are guided by data and geospatial information. Mm-hmm. You know, now at the time of shrinking funding, you need data to really tell you the truth about the emergencies and the people affected by them. So this is basically what my organization does. We're based in Oxfordshire in the UK, but I also sit on the board of Christian Aid and on the advisory board with Humanitarian Quality Assurance Initiative and on the advisory panel of Accountable Now. So as you could possibly tell, a lot of my focus is generally around making sure that the aid is accountable, data-driven. So this is basically what's been my passion. And I also write quite a bit on LinkedIn about that and how it combines with the commitments of localization and decolonization and propping up local organizations that are always there, not going anywhere, know their culture, and ultimately cost less.
And so what led you to the humanitarian field, and what was your career trajectory? And, you know, particularly what led you towards the side of accountability?
It's an interesting story. My first introduction to the world of humanitarian aid was when I was 9 and my family was living in southern Azerbaijan. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. It was the middle of 1992. And my dad once came home with a box of humanitarian aid. That's probably was the first time when I heard the word humanitarian aid. Mm-hmm. And it was from Germany. He said it had foreign writing all over, and he told me it was in German because the poverty was soaring in the country and so was instability. I guess that's why we received that assistance. I don't remember my family being in particular hardship, but then I guess you wouldn't trust the memory of a 9-year-old with that. Mm-hmm. I know my parents don't like talking about that period. It was very difficult for them as a young family. So that really shocked me. I remember standing in front of a big map thinking, wow, I found Germany and I looked where we were on the border with Iran, and I couldn't comprehend how somebody who doesn't even know us, because previously, you know, of course, you know about solidarity and help, but it's normally from the family or friends or neighbors, your community, people who know you. But then somebody who doesn't know you and probably will never get to know you is concerned enough to step up, step in and do something. That blew my mind. And I think that was a much more formative experience than I realized it for many years. So eventually I studied, went to uni and joined the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. I worked a lot on the disaster response and disaster preparedness, ended up working with the United Nations Development Program in the Caribbean later on. And throughout observing what was going on in the sector, I saw many mistakes happening, you know, in the same spaces all the time, irrelevant aid, not delivered to the right people, delivered in a way that was undermining the dignity of people for whom the aid was meant, or not delivered in the right time, for example. took too long or the wrong season or whatever, not taking into account religious background of people who we were trying to assist. So that made me want to work more on the so-called humanitarian quality, making sure that the aid is relevant. It's reaching the relevant people, the relevant time, the relevant way, and itself is relevant because obviously the sector has always been underfunded. You always have limited amount of money for the growing number of needs, and you need to prioritize. So how do you do it? By finding the most vulnerable, most affected, and giving them what they actually want, not what you think they should want. So I've worked on that for the last 10 years probably, and that's been my key focus.
You said two things that are very important. I think people don't know much about. You said giving without undermining the dignity of the people who are going to receive and giving them what they want instead of what you perceive they want. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's something I think people don't understand. I've worked in the humanitarian field in the past, and I've heard grumblings of, oh, we've tried to help them. And I always thought to myself, but nobody called you. You came to help. And
I know many of these things, they come from a good place, right? So I've gone through my own phases of being on this high horse, moral high horse. Like, how could you give something so, disempowering to people? But ultimately, I realized that when people want to give, it comes from a good place. Although it does not mean that it's not going to do harm just because it's meant well. And we see it everywhere in the sector that it does happen. And now there are more safeguards in place, which I hope are not going to be disrupted too much by the current funding crisis to make sure that it doesn't happen, but it still happens. And ultimately, giving examples is, I've been in places, I remember once receiving a whole container of in-kind donations from abroad. I'm not going to tell you from where, because again, well-meaning people wanted to support people in another part of the world. I had to go to the customs office several times. We had to pay very high fees for that container to be held where it needed to be held. Then we had to transport it to our warehouse. Our warehouse was very limited, etc. When we opened the container, it was full of used clothes and, other things that were clearly shared in the spirit of giving, support, solidarity, and completely unusable in the context to which it was sent. I could not possibly give it to the people affected by that emergency, the items from that container, because it would be an insult. Yeah. The whole thought of supporting your fellow humans somewhere else in the world is very beautiful. This is what my life in the humanitarian sector started from, right? But I also know that it can be very humiliating. Yeah. Humanitarian aid can be very humiliating, and I think we need to take better decisions as to how we minimize that, because people are already very vulnerable when they're in that place. Nobody wants to receive humanitarian aid unless they absolutely need to.
Yeah. Many things have changed since we booked our interview a few weeks ago. U.S. funding has been pulled from many humanitarian aid organizations, and the state of humanitarian aid is in limbo. You've posted about the situation and have throughout your career pointed out the failings in your field. And you most recently talked about the trolley effect in your LinkedIn post. Can you explain what you mean? And can you speak about the way forward for the humanitarian field?
I'll start with the trolley because this is easier. This famous moral dilemma, moral problem that's posed to people studying ethics. You have this runaway trolley, brakes are not working, and it's headed down one track on which later down the track, there are 4 or 5 people. Many people are tied down to it. And if you don't divert the trolley, they're going to be hurt, if not worse, by the trolley, most likely worse. And on the other side, on the other track, to which you can switch the trolley because you are at the lever and you can switch it if you choose to, there's just one person. And you're there faced with this moral dilemma, ethical dilemma. Do you choose to basically kill one person to save the lives of 4? Or are you going to let the trolley do what it's headed to do and not participate? And I find that currently the humanitarian sector is dealing with its own version of this dilemma. The current funding cuts that are being passed down to local offices of international organizations, but also to local organizations that have been the partners, the frontline workers, the so-called implementing partners for so many of these international organizations are feeling these cuts probably the most. I've spoken to a few local organizations over the last few weeks, and many of them, of those who spoke to me, are saying that they don't know if they're going to make it past this month. So they were heavily reliant on USAID funding or US Department of State funding. And currently they are not in a place where they can quickly replace that funding. So that means that their operations are going to fold. And my argument basically is that on the other track are those big international INGOs that could choose to either merge, shrink, let go of power, and divert most of their funding to local organizations. And saving the local organizations is essential because they are the people who work with communities affected by crises. For years, they have delivered the bulk of the work in the so-called field, and currently letting that local humanitarian ecosystem vanish is going to completely undo all that capacity development, all that investment that has happened into those organizations at a modest but still very real scale over the last decade. And also those organizations are much more vulnerable, the local ones. They don't have the reserves. They don't have alternative funding sources. And I think it's our moral obligation to shrink as international actors to make sure that those local agencies are still there when the funding freezes over or when alternative funding sources are found.
So that's the way forward for you? That's the way.
I don't see how we can go any other way and retain any sort of moral claim to being humanitarians.
Yeah.
Because it obviously provides greater efficiencies. Local organizations, not only do they know the communities better, they're also a lot more cost efficient. Their operational costs are lower on average. And if we remove all the middlemen from the system, or at least some, it's going to mean greater impact for communities and a lifeline for these organizations. So. I think if we don't do that, to me, it reeks of moral bankruptcy of the international INGO sector. And I honestly have no idea how we are going to come back from this if this is not the route we choose.
That's interesting. I think a lot of people don't know that the first responders to crises are the local organizations. They tend to show a lot. We came in to help. And I think one thing too that's missing is that a lot of the people working on these crises are also victims of the crisis. So
absolutely.
All of the impacts, it's a very interesting dilemma. Thank you for pointing it out. I think people don't know.
I think it's one of the sector's best kept secrets that most of the humanitarian work is done by locals. They are the first responders. They are the local people who are there right away when the massive humanitarian infrastructure is now just being unfolded, The locals are already there supporting the members of their own communities. And I think we don't work enough with the media to paint the real picture of what aid sector is. White saviors saving the day in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. It's the local people who do need financial leg up every now and then because they don't come from such rich nations as many global minority people do. But the bulk of the work is done by them.
Yep. So you describe yourself as a woman, mother, and immigrant. Diaspora in Development is a platform for people of the diaspora to talk about their unique perspective in their field. Can you tell us how your identity as an immigrant influences your work?
I added it to my bio when the anti-immigration sentiments peaked in the UK last summer. And I thought that, of course, I am not the targeted immigrant, right? Because I'm the good immigrant, right? I tick the boxes for the immigrants who are allowed. But on the other hand, I realize that it's become such an integral part of who I am and how I make decisions and how I see problems that it's definitely something that's influencing my work. I come from Russia, that place that used to be called the Second World, the Eastern Bloc. It was the Second World, right? Now we speak about the First World and the Third World, and nobody's asking about the second one anymore. But I come from that place, and that place in the middle. And I know that historically, my home country used to be a colonizer. Absolutely. So in many ways, I can relate to people from the global north and understand the guilt that comes with recognizing the damage colonialism has done and wanting to do something, but also the certain blindness to the problems of people who live in the former colonies, or assumptions that you know the solutions just because you speak the same language or you think you have a shared history. And while some of your history is shared, quite a bit of it was lived differently by people in those places. But on the other hand, I also know when the Soviet Union collapsed, what happened to my homeland was some sort of colonization as well by many of the Western institutions. And while some of that possibly was welcome, other things were less pretty. And I also know that we have always been othered, Whenever I tell people that I'm Russian, I see that face. It happened before the war in Ukraine. It's happening a lot more now, and I completely understand it. I, like many other Russians, absolutely hate what's happening in the Ukraine, and I've spoken out about it many times, and that's the reason why I'm not going back home anytime soon, because I can simply get in jail for just a few social media posts I made, and there are many, many of us like that. But on the other hand, yes, I know what it's like to be a colonizer, what it's like to be colonized. I worked as a local aid provider back home, and I know what it's like to be local aid provider when you're working with expats, with internationals, and how different your worlds are, how different the places you can afford to live are, how they would live in parts of your capital you could never dream of living if you want to stay in the sector, right? And all the tensions that come with it. So I think when you bring all of that richness, for want of a better word, of experience into immigration, you also see your new home country very differently, and you basically learn not to take anything for granted. You have this heightened ability for critical thinking, I would say cultural sensitivity as well, because things are done a certain way in one place and completely differently in another. And that ability to see nuance and to fully embrace the humanity of people you work with, be they your colleagues from the wealthy nations or the communities receiving assistance in the majority world. I think if you use it correctly, it can be a superpower in the sector.
Very interesting, because I was about to say, I always think that as I get older, being othered is a superpower, because it gives me a lot of perspective. It gives me ample empathy. So yeah, I'm very glad to use superpower.
I totally agree. I think once you abandon the pipe dream of absolutely fully fitting in your new place, in your new country, which I think I had in the beginning, and I thankfully quickly buried that dream. You learn to live in that space quite comfortably. And you also find people like yourself, and that's your own new community. And maybe not fitting in fully is definitely, it's a superpower.
Also, once you leave, you don't fit in back home as well. So it's a very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Like that poem, here you are, too foreign for home, too foreign for here, never enough for both. So exactly that.
This is what diaspora and development is all about. Can you talk about how do we decolonize the humanitarian field?
I think the first and possibly most difficult step would be to agree to be uncomfortable. It can't be comfortable, right? And I know that whenever I speak to people about it, many people close off. I know that I don't necessarily fit the typical profile of a person who would speak about decolonization. But on the other hand, I think some of the characteristics of me give me the privilege that comes with them, possibly makes it even more important for me to speak about it, because colonization and decolonization took so many shapes and can take so many shapes, and they need to be examined. So I think once you are past that, or it's going to be uncomfortable, we can go down two routes, and ideally both of them at the same time. We can work through, systems and processes, examining how your organization is dealing with power, how power is distributed, what biases are there, how they contributed into the development of the policies, procedures, systems within the organization, and unpick it little by little. And while you do all of that, you also need to work on the so-called, hearts and minds stream, where you constantly humanize people to the colleagues that you're working with. Humanize them through authentic stories, not poverty porn, not the noble savages narratives, not the narratives about people being architects of their own misfortune or not being capable enough, etc., but constantly reintroducing that, shared humanity narrative. I like speaking about it, that, throughout my life and my career in this sector, I've seen so many different families and people, women who, when you ask them what they want for themselves, for their kids, it's always the same. People all over the world want the same things for themselves and for their families. They want security. They want good opportunities for their kids. And, that's it. And most people are quite charitable. Many people have that sense of solidarity, not just for their communities, but for, others, in places more remote. So I think that needs to be constantly reminded of to people who have the power to be working on decolonization. And I think ultimately, while decolonization needs to be underpinned by, more than talk, right? It needs to be the power transfer. So once you've learned how the power works within your organization or your sector, you need to be able to be brave about changing the power structures. And I know that they're rigid and there's no way around it. You are going to have to change them if you want to be honest about what you're doing. And of course, there's going to be a lot of pushback. I've recently argued that, we need to transfer resources directly to local organizations. And I've got quite a bit of pushback on, yes, but it's going to be unfair to local organizations because they're not ready.
They're not able to absorb.
Yes, they won't absorb it. And exactly. And I thought, it's not going to be a perfect transition if it were to happen that way. I absolutely get it. Local organizations will probably make mistakes. But what's important to remember are the massive mistakes international organizations made and what they learned and didn't learn from it.
Yes.
So you need to adjust the risk lenses as well. I've been really wrestling with this whole risk perception when it comes to funding local organizations directly. They are inherently perceived as more risky.
Yeah.
But when you look at the track record, there is absolutely no evidence to support that claim. Local organizations are no more risky than international ones. And even when that risk is real, the scale at which it's going to be, damaging is so much smaller. Than that in international organizations. So even from the efficiencies perspective, I don't see any other way around other than, power and resource transfer. But it's not going to happen just through policies and funding. It needs to happen at the level of daily interactions to make sure that you avoid that othering, that you don't schedule calls during the Ramadan, fast breaking hours, that you learn to pronounce people's names. I mean, take some time, ask them, how do they pronounce their name, and similar things. So it needs to come both ways.
That's very interesting, some of the things that you've said. One of my concerns not concern, but I understand, and I liked the idea, and I fully I'm on board with the idea of decolonizing humanitarian aid, decolonizing development aid. One of the things that I realized as a woman of color is that what I learn at school and what other people learn at school is that we are weaker, we are more vulnerable. And I wonder if great changes can be made without changing what we learn at school. Changing what we learn. It's an interesting thing because that's a big fight as well because
internalized vulnerability.
Learn.
I think where I'm from, it's the similar narrative about women. So as a woman, you're inherently more fragile, which is absolutely ridiculous considering that women were part of the workforce in the Soviet Union probably earlier than in many other nations, that the first woman in space was from there. And yet there is this hugely...
not about the internalization of how we internalize. It's, if we're talking about decolonization, we have to understand that most of the people that we talk to, whether they are coming from the North or whether they are the recipient, what they have learned is a typical a narrative. And is it possible to combat those narratives with stories? I think it is, but I'm just asking.
No, I think so. I think those narratives, they are stories that stuck with us, right?
Yeah.
I don't think the numbers, etc. I work for a data organization, but I know nothing influences a decision maker than a story behind the data. That's why you don't just share data, you share a story. And that's something that is much more likely to make a difference or to change a decision of someone who's in a position to make those decisions. And stories, absolutely. I fully believe in that. I just think we need to be very careful with how we tell those stories, right? There's this whole narrative about poverty porn. Of course, poverty porn is effective. If you pull at people's heartstrings, people are more likely to give to these, starving kids with flies in their eyes, etc. But in the long term, these dehumanizing, victimizing narratives, they're not going to serve anyone. And I've seen many organizations work in that direction to move away from poverty porn and still be successful in fundraising and kind of strengthening the solidarity narrative rather than charity. And I think what also needs to happen is that people in the global north or global minority need to also understand or need to be told in a non-confrontational way that solidarity or even charity, but I would not like to use that word, is a global thing. It doesn't just come from the wealthy nations. That nations like Myanmar or Kenya, Indonesia, they continuously top the lists of nations who give the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In relation to their income, it's the global majority nations that are the most charitable. But in absolute terms, yes, maybe they are not, but it doesn't matter. They give possibly more than compared to the rest of us, right? And I think it's important because otherwise it reinforces the power imbalance.
Mm-hmm. Good example in Caribbean and Latin American region is Cuba. Cuba does a lot to support regional crises through medical aid, through disaster risk support. And I think it's little known.
Yeah, I think Cuban doctors are a global brand, right? Now, we go everywhere. Before big aid bureaucracies even begin thinking, they're already landing there. And I absolutely loved when they came to Italy during the pandemic, when, the nations in Europe were, closing borders, isolating, and kind of taking the wait and see approach. Cuban doctors landed there in northern Italy that was reeling from the highest, rates of COVID cases. So that was a great lesson. I'm just very sad that media normally fall into that trap of perpetuating those narratives that we want to combat. And the narrative about those Cuban doctors would have been a great way to show that solidarity is a global thing. It's not just a global north thing.
Indeed. What's the future for funding for humanitarian aid?
I think this is the biggest conversation that's currently happening in the sector, with many people waiting and seeing if the aid freeze by the US government is a temporary thing, really is a pause, while others are starting to say this is not a pause. This is at the end. You can go and start looking for other sources. It's hard to tell now, but it's becoming more and more evident that the humanitarian funding, overall global development, the funding for, official development assistance is shrinking across the board. Many governments in Europe have now announced cuts to their aid budgets, not just the United States, although obviously the cuts by the United States pose possibly the most existential threat currently, and also because they were introduced in such an abrupt manner. But we already know that the Dutch, the Swedes, the Germans are cutting their aid budgets. UK cut the aid budgets during the pandemic, and they have not gone back to the same level of funding. And this is just the new era, clearly, for us. So we are seeing if there are going to be new donors from the less traditional parts of the world, less traditional meaning less known for funding development assistance globally. So I don't know, we're looking to Gulf states, to East Asian countries. I know Japan and Korea have been very actively funding development assistance. Are they going to step up? We all know that no government currently is in a position to bridge the gap left by the US government funding. So that also gives us an opportunity to discuss this with philanthropists, high net worth individuals. I have a lot of people coming to me saying, why don't we talk to the richest people who have way more resources to bridge the gaps than any government or most governments ever will? That's a good question, and I think we should be. And also the innovative finance, the bonds, the insurance, blended funding, public, private. Many private institutions have been making profit from humanitarian operations forever. So we can as well start leveraging our relationships with them to the benefit of the communities. So I think nowadays we just need to make sure that through the period of attrition that's definitely going to follow the aid freeze, how do we preserve the most critical parts of the humanitarian infrastructure ecosystem, that when we would have found new sources of funding, we'll be able to start or continue delivering life-saving assistance, but also development assistance. And I am not currently impressed by what I'm hearing about those conversations. And I recently went to this humanitarian finance summit here in London, and one of the participants said that the funding shortfall created by the withdrawal of the US government is 40 billion. And for her, someone coming from a private sector, from finance sector, a 40 billion shortfall was ridiculously small. And she insisted that it's not a money issue. It's a systems issue. So I'm just hopeful that we're using this moment, this period, to fix some of those systems.
Is there a role for diaspora to play?
That's one of the avenues that I've heard being explored as to how we can leverage remittances to ensure that the money are going to the country, to the people most affected by crises. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not talked about enough by diaspora's contribution and the huge percentage of income in countries supported by diaspora that it represents. On the other hand, I think the international humanitarian system needs to become much leaner and more transparent if it wants to benefit from funding streams from diaspora. I remember working with Ukrainian diaspora here, and when the full-scale invasion happened 3 years ago, and I was very grateful to be let into that space being a Russian, but I also heard so many conversations between Ukrainians who wanted to make sure that their pounds went as far as they possibly could in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And they were saying, okay, don't donate to such and such and such organizations because they're going to take the most of it and very little money is going to reach the population in question. So how do we change that perception? Mm-hmm. But also, that perception, it didn't form in a vacuum.
No.
There's some truth to it. So we need to get leaner. We're not operating in a silo. People outside of the silo, they see what we're doing and they want us to be more accountable. And if we want their money, we need to be.
Indeed. I've always thought that working on one humanitarian crisis after another is not good for the humanitarian worker, the organization, and the people they bring aid to. Can you speak a little bit about the life of an aid worker and what you think can be improved?
I think I've seen over the last decade a growing recognition of the need for some well-being interventions among the aid worker community. I think when I started, almost 20 years ago, there was still this mindset that, you are expected to be a hero. You basically push your own comfort aside and you go ahead and you do it because this is what you're there for. But obviously, I think we've all seen this jaded, burnt out humanitarians in those, expat bar in Juba or in DRC or somewhere in the Middle East. And, possibly not a bar in the Middle East, but you know what I mean, who cannot stop talking about that time when they saw that particular crisis and how it changed them. I know Haiti affected many of us really deeply, those who landed there in the first couple of weeks of the earthquake. I think the attitude of just push through it, you don't matter, is now slowly changing. On the other hand, I think with the current funding squeeze, and it started way before the government cuts by the United States, all these programs didn't always get cut first. And it's basically up to humanitarians to put that oxygen mask on themselves. And while we all have communities, we have circles of friends and we pass, coaches and therapists contacts from one to another, I don't think there's enough institutional commitment to it currently. Mm-hmm. And also there's not enough recognition to how different groups of humanitarians can be affected very differently. I remember being a breastfeeding mother, of working with organizations that were establishing breastfeeding places for mothers in the community so that they could continue, providing nutrition to their infants. And I had to push quite hard to have a space in my office where I could pump milk for my baby. And that kind of double narrative, we do it for communities, or at least we say we do it for communities, but you don't ask for the same thing for yourself. That also needs to change. But also I remember when George Floyd was murdered, so many people that I work with in my then organization here in London were affected deeper than others because, of course, they could relate to that much more. So how do we provide spaces to those people who might be affected by different global events differently? I think it's not just a funding issue. It's also the issue of mentality of moving away from that, just get through it, get on with this. You're not important. You don't matter. What you do matters. And we have scores of humanitarians with PTSD, and currently more and more and more of them are emerging because I'm talking to friends and colleagues who are having to let people go and now put in that weird position of playing God with people's lives. And while we all understand that the communities is what we're here for, nobody wants to let people go during funding crisis because they are your family. We always work very closely with each other. So we need to be agile about that.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about humanitarian reform, I've always thought that the way organizations work also needs to be, not just prizing international staff over local staff, et cetera, but perhaps rotations. I don't think, I'm of Haitian heritage. I worked a couple of years out after the earthquake, and it was my first foray working with people that I thought had alcoholism issues, that I thought had PTSD, that had communication issues because they couldn't speak the language, but they were experts. So you would have meetings where you're talking about housing, and the local community had to translate. And I thought, oh my gosh, how do you work that all in, particularly if you're not well because of all of the years of, it's an interesting dilemma.
And how does it stop being a badge of honor? Look how broken I am by this work that I've given my all. And while it might be true, obviously, you need to be relatively well yourself to support others that you're there to do, right?
Do you have any heroes or organizations that you admire in this field that you want to highlight?
I thought about it a few years ago, that all my heroes, like, Sergio Vieira de Mello, the one who died and who was killed in the bomb explosion in Baghdad in 2003, I think, and the commemoration of whose death we now mark on the 19th of August, and World Humanitarian Day, or other aid workers. And it struck me that they were all men, and I thought, it doesn't obviously disqualify you from being my hero if you're a man, but it also was quite striking that, there were no women on the list. And as you read memoirs about those famous humanitarians, they always have this, trailing spouse or a wife at home, back home in Geneva, who is looking after the children and, just enabling their careers to soar. And I thought that, I want to find women. I want to find women in this space. And there are many brilliant, incredible women in this space, but who I really found to be my heroes. For example, one of my colleagues in the Philippines, we had a chat with her last year, and she was talking to me about a project that they were running. And she said that the budget wasn't massive and that they had to decrease their salaries to make sure more money was left to intervene within the communities in a way that was going to make a difference. I remember she said, of course we can give ourselves bigger salaries. She's very senior in her role and she really could just reallocate the funds. But she said, but we need this money for communities. And I thought, yes, this woman is much more of a hero to me.
Yeah.
Or I remember talking to a woman in a IDP camp in South Sudan, the woman who spent her whole life in displacement. She was roughly my age at the time. She was moving from camp to camp with her 2 children. She had lost touch with the other 2, and she bumped into her niece in one of the camps, and she took her under her wing, and then somebody else. And then she was supporting this orphan because basically she had so little to share, and she was still sharing it. And while being seen by the aid system as this, the affected or the vulnerable, the marginalized, she was an absolute powerhouse of a woman who was not deterred by the lifetime of hardship. And she was absolutely determined to, support everyone she could around her. And she is my hero. And she is a humanitarian. Humanitarians are not just the people with, certain emblems on their vests. It's an attitude, and hers definitely was that.
Thank you. What are you most proud of in your career?
I think the thing that I'm most proud of would probably not be some standalone achievement or an event or moment of realization. I think I am very happy to say that what I've been doing over the last decade and what's really been firing me up is humanizing communities and local aid providers to the decision makers in the global north. I've been doing it intentionally and passionately, and I want to believe that it changed some of the decisions about resource allocations, the language we use about communities, the programming, the transition plans, etc. That drive to make sure that people in the majority world are seen as people equal to us, who just by the luck of birth have found themselves in a situation where they're more exposed to hardship and crisis than we are, and how we can shape programs that support them in a way that upholds their equal humanity rather than ignores it. And I think this is probably it. I've managed to not get on the moral high horse about this should be done like this or you're wrong. I've found a way to navigate that space between these groups, hopefully without alienating any of them. And I'm planning to continue, be it through data, through accountability to affected communities, humanitarian quality, or anything like that, because the moment we start perceiving the entire countries and communities as the other, very different from us, I think this is where our humanitarian intentions and values fail.
Thank you, Marina. I think we'll end on that note.
Yeah. Okay. It was very, very, very interesting to talk, and thank you. Got me thinking about on many things.
Join us every first Tuesday of the month. Don't forget to like us, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and find us on Instagram and on our website if you'd like to be featured as a guest or have any recommendations for guests. We look forward to hearing from you.